Now we're joined by Johnny Miller himself from Donbass to tell us more about the situation there. Have you received any threats, Johnny? Do you fear for your life? Tell us more about the situation.
Did you ask me a question?
Johnny, do you fear for your life? Have you received any threats whatsoever?
I haven't received any threats at the moment, and there is a large Russian army between myself and other people on the list here in Donbass and the Ukrainian nationalists in western Ukraine. But most people who are on the list, the 13-year-old Fina, who I interviewed, have already been receiving threats of physical violence against them. And there's no doubt that this list does promote violence and the killing of anybody on that list.
And how is this even justified? This is coming from the European people that are supposed to be civilized.
I did this story for Press TV. I actually contacted the website for a statement, which is normal journalistic standards. They didn't reply to my request for a statement from them, or rather they did reply. They put me on the list. And it's clear that some parts of Ukrainian society is descending into some kind of Kafkaesque nightmare when a journalist does a legitimate story about a kill list and is simply put on the list themselves. I'm not surprised I've been put on the list. I did realize that there might be a possibility after doing this story that I would be. But what I am surprised about is that there's at the moment no pressure from Western governments to take down this list. The United Nations, other organizations have demanded it be taken down. But there's a idea, particularly in the Western media, that there is no or very little extremism in Ukraine. Some of my reporting here in Ukraine has been to highlight the extremist elements within Ukrainian society. And this website is very much a symbol of that. A website that openly promotes violence against children. There's over 300 children on that list, and violence towards journalists. It's very hard to promote the myth that anybody who promotes stories about there being extremism in Ukraine, it's just Russian propaganda. It's very hard to push that line when this website exists. It's not a good look, and there should be more pressure from Western countries to take down this list. Promoting violence towards children and journalists is extremist behavior, symptomatic of an extremist ideology. So it's not a good look for Ukraine to carry on with this list. The Ukrainian government has the power to take down this list. NATO countries have huge influence over Ukraine, and there doesn't seem to be at the moment any pressure to take down this list.
So, Johnny, if you could please stand by while I bring in Greg Simons, a researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies, who's joining us from Sweden. Mr. Simons, I assume that you've heard our correspondent and, in his words, the threats that he's receiving, being put on a list openly on a website that is being supported. What does that tell us about Europeans who have always claimed to be advocates of human rights and freedom of expression?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it raises the level of hypocrisy which is being present here, because on the one hand, this is clearly not only an ethical and moral question, it's also a legal question. If we look at the morals and ethics of threatening to kill and at the same time calling such a country a democracy which openly allow and permit this to continue. And then on the other hand, I mean, this whole EU thing about this, the Data Protection Act, which they talk about, giving away private details. I mean, this is violating all kinds of laws, nationally, internationally. The fact that the Ukrainian government has not shut it down means that they do nothing. And it is interesting also the fact that the reaction to it, because the reaction is the so-called is doing something which absolutely contradicts everything which is being told about their brand, which is being curated. So what do? you can either ignore the problem, which quite a few of them are doing, or to try and explain and justify it. And I mean, Johnny's in good company. I mean, even Kissinger he hasn't been put on the kill list, but he's been put accomplices. So there is no limit to their activity.
So, Mr. Simons, what are some ways to protect the people on the list? Are there any legal means to pursue the matter internationally?
Well, internationally, I suppose this would have to be something which would be taken by the EU, and of course, they should be enforcing this data protection, which is codified. It's in law, and they're not doing anything. You've also got the Council of Europe, there's European Court of Human Rights. The fact that nothing is being done, I think, speaks more it's loudly than if something was being done, then the system would be functioning in some way. But the fact that there are no noises, I think it's more frightening than if there were noises.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greg Simons, a researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies from Sweden. Now let's go back to our correspondent, Johnny. If you could please tell us more about your situation. Should we be worried about you? And of course, you've always done the most difficult reports for Press TV. You've always been to dangerous places, and now you're in a war zone, which obviously poses its own challenges, even if you were not receiving these threats. But were you expecting this to happen?
Well, as I said, I did suspect this might be a possibility, and I certainly can't ever return to the west of Ukraine. Anybody on that list in the west of Ukraine is in serious threat of their life. There's many Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the worst places to work as a journalist. One, because there's a war going on, but also because there've been journalists killed in West Ukraine over recent years. Well, if I was a journalist in the west of Ukraine, no doubt I'd be reporting on Russian strikes and the fact that the vast majority of people in the west of Ukraine are against the Russian invasion. But here in Russian-held Donbass, it's a very different story. I take my work very seriously. I'm a very honest journalist. I stand by the integrity of all my work here. But the stories you cover from this side of the conflict are different than the stories you cover in the west of Ukraine. Ukraine is shelling civilians here. A school was bombed just literally over the road from my apartment. So when I look out the window and I see a school bombed by the Ukrainian army, what story am I going to cover that day? And of course, the fact that the vast majority of people here in this part of Ukraine support the Russian invasion, it's my job as a journalist to reflect that. And on the website, on this kill list, it details my work and says that somehow I'm promoting Russian propaganda. I'm simply telling the truth, covering the stories, the facts that are around me right now, and that's my job as a journalist. Many journalists are risking their lives on both sides of this conflict, and the attack on journalists, openly attack on promotion of violence against journalists by the Ukrainian government in full view of the world. Let's remember that Ukraine is now a candidate status of the European Union. It's promoting a website that is publishing the home addresses of 13-year-old girls and promoting violence against them and attacks on journalists. And for the European Union and Western countries to not have a problem with this is shocking. At the moment, of course, even the Western media, it's very hard to get stories published that are critical of Ukraine because it's seen as Russian propaganda. But at some point that has to change because websites like this are against all kinds of basic human decency. When you promote violence towards children, it gives you a sign of the problem of extremism within Ukraine. And it's not acceptable on the European continent to have that kind of level of extremism, not just against journalists, but particularly against children. So the website really needs to be taken down and more pressure put on the Ukrainian authorities to shut it down.
So, Johnny, do you know exactly who is running this website? You did mention something about neo-Nazi groups.
Well, it's quite shady. I would call them ultra-nationalist groups. There's certainly plenty of neo-Nazis, like the Azov battalion in Ukraine as well. but there's also been public support previously from Ukrainian government ministers. The previous Minister of Interior applauded the site. So, and there's the reports that the Ukrainian government used this database. So if I was coming into Western Ukraine and they wanted to check who I was, they may well look at this database and see that I am an enemy of Ukraine. So there's been reports that it's actively used by intelligence or security services there. The website says that it is specifically set up for government and security services. So there's no doubt that previously the Ukrainian government has praised this site, and it does have the power to take it down. But it's also a sign of the influence of ultra-nationalists and extremists in Ukraine. If the Ukrainian government doesn't have the power to take down this site, that it's against all human rights law, it's also a sign of just the influence that these extremist groups have in the Ukrainian political system.
It seems that Russia's concern about ultra-nationalists and neo-Nazis when it was being declared back then before the war began is not baseless after all.
Well, it's interesting before the war. Some Western media outlets, the BBC, The Guardian, Time magazine, did some fantastic reporting. You can go on YouTube, some brilliant short documentaries by these organizations detailing the neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine. But since the war began, since the Russian invasion began, that's all been turned on its head. It's like George Orwell, when yesterday this is the truth, today this is the truth. And so any kind of promotion of these stories is just deemed as Russian propaganda. I don't speak Russian, I don't watch much Russian media. Russians may well be overplaying the Nazi problem in Ukraine, but in Western media it's being whitewashed. And when you've got that level of extremism, I've been to Mariupol, I've spoken to civilians there who tell me that they were forced at gunpoint down to the basement by these neo-Nazi groups, and that they were targeting civilians on the streets. Once again, as a journalist, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. It's my job just to simply report what these eyewitnesses are telling me. So there is definitely a serious problem with extremism in Ukraine, and frankly, every serious journalist in Western Ukraine knows that. They know that there's a serious problem with extremism in Ukraine, but it's a large part of self-censorship as well, because if you try and go to your editor now and say, well, look, I've got this story about extremism in Ukraine, Western papers are simply not going to take that at the moment because they see it as Russian propaganda. When I was in Kiev, a Western journalist told me he's trying to get frontline access in Ukraine, but every unit he went to was run by Azov, and he didn't want to work with them because they're extremists. So it's open knowledge that there's a real problem with extremism here in Ukraine, but there's a propaganda war over that fact.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent, Johnny Miller, joining us live from Donbass.